Afternoon, everybody. Welcome back after lunch. I'm Daniel Mansfield, Head of Policy Engagement in the policy team at BSI, and I'm joined for this session by Doug McWilliams of the Centre for Economics and Business Research, and we're going to take you through the 2021 study that CEBR have done on the economic impact of standards in the UK. We've got a few slides and then we'll leave a little bit of time at the end for Q&A. So I think with that, I think I can hand over to you, Doug.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I'm Doug McWilliams, and I led the study. I'm also the Deputy Chairman of CEBR, and we carried out the study in conjunction with a range of my colleagues and some help from University College London. What I'd like to do is give you a quick pre-publication view of what the results of the study are. And incidentally, the study is an update of one that we did for you in 2015. I'll go through the approach, and then we did, as usual, an update, a review of the latest literature. We carried out a survey, and I'd like to pay tribute to Daniel's colleagues for the assistance. They did all the hard work, and we merely argued about the questions. Then we did some economic modeling, and I'll tell you a bit about the modeling methodology before getting to the real meat, which is the conclusions. So what was our approach? First, we wanted to catch up with the latest literature. Then, with Daniel and his colleagues, we carried out a survey of 1,000 firms in 16 sectors. I'll tell you more about that in detail. It was quite detailed quantitative research on the role of standards within the companies that were covered. The next thing is that we put together a modeling framework, which involved a trade model, a productivity model, a UK macro model, and then we fed all that through into an input-output model with 104 different sectors, which we used to estimate the sectoral implications and the environmental implications. We came up with a presentation of the results at the beginning of September. We gave Daniel and his colleagues a draft report at the end of September, and I'm working on editing the report to give Daniel the final report round about the end of the month. So he will talk to you about the timing of release and so on. The literature search. These are just highlights, really. I mean, there's lots of pages on it if you want to read the report. But first thought is that standards and literature on standards is much more international than it has been in the past, particularly the use of standards in the Pacific Rim and places like China. The second thought is that we've tried, but not completely succeeded, in trying to go beyond the normal measure of the extensiveness of standards, which is by using the stock. We've tried to see if we can incorporate concepts such as technical complexity. I have to say at the end, we ended up using the stock of standards, but we were very aware that that is quite a simplified form, and particularly when you get internationalization of standards, very often the stock, even though standards cover a wider area, the actual number can reduce. Compared with the 2015 study, we noticed that standards for health and safety had become relatively more important, and environmental standards had become relatively more important. The impact of standards on productivity seemed to be about the same, judging by the literature, and the literature suggested that the impact of standards on international trade has become a bit more important, and that's obviously not taking account of Brexit, which might further enhance the role of standards. And averaging from the literature, it suggested that a 10% increase in the stock of standards would lead to an increase in labour productivity of between 0.5% and 1.1%, or an increase in total factor productivity of between 1/3 and 0.71%. In other words, translating that into a GDP number between 7 and 15.5 billion at 2019 pounds. Let me come on to the survey. We covered 16 sectors, and as you can see, there's quite a broad sectoral coverage. We also had a decent coverage across firm sizes, which is useful. The previous survey covered only half as many firms, and it was a bit weak on SMEs. This one has tried to pick up SMEs in rather more detail. If you take the crosshatch of firm sizes and sectors, again, you can see there's a decent spread. Now, what about the results of the survey? Well, this is the breakdown by size, and you can see that the majority of firms of all sizes, not just the large ones, but also the medium, small, and micro, benefit from the use of standards. And there's an interesting quirk here, which is that the micro firms, which are quite often new and possibly in areas like IT, seem to benefit even more than the small firms, which is slightly counterintuitive unless you make this allowance for the fact that micro firms are more likely to be new firms. If you look by sector, all the sectors claim to benefit from standards. This is a net benefit calculation, except for one, which is automotive. Now, we've done some ex-survey analysis talking to people in the motor industry. We think the most likely explanation that the automotive people have come out as an outlier on this is that the survey was carried out not all that long after the government announced that there was to be a ban on the sales of internal combustion-based engined cars from 2030. We think that that was treated as a standard, whereas technically it's a regulation, not a standard. And we think that's probably, that's quite a controversial issue in the motor industry, as I'm sure you all know. And we think that that possibly was the explanation why automotive were less enthusiastic than every single other sector. As far as the impact on the economy is concerned, each sector is represented by two columns. The one on the left is the initial effect. The one on the right is the ongoing effect. Standards are clearly associated with significant increases in turnover. Now, just if you want to go back to the automotive point, remember the previous one was about net benefit. So if you try and translate it, saying they think there's extra turnover, but they don't have a net benefit because they presumably assume that the increased costs are in excess of the increased turnover. One of the other important changes in this year's survey compared with the one in 2015 was the much better coverage of the service sector. And some of the impacts of that are seen in this. There is a question about the impact on GVA, which we translated into an estimate about the extent to which GVA would be increased. Gross value added is roughly the same thing as GDP. There's a slight valuation difference, but don't worry about it too much. And what is interesting here, and the blue line is the most important one, is that healthcare, ICT, finance, and professional services came out in the survey as the ones where the impact on GVA from standards was assessed to be greatest. That's quite an important result because in the past, I think standards have tended to be looked at much more in terms of their impact on the manufacturing sector. What this is saying is that there is a very significant impact in the service sector and in some of these most important new and fast growing parts of the service sector. The impact on productivity from the survey is that it's boosted in all standards, boost productivity in all sizes of firms, but the extent of the boost tends to increase as firms get larger. That's not entirely surprising. Standards are expected to produce competitiveness, particularly in export capacity. And asked how standards boosted competitiveness, the two things that come out most strongly are avoiding a race to the bottom and increasing market share. Even for small and medium-sized enterprises, the respondents to the survey reckoned that standards boosted market access, which is quite important, both in domestic and foreign markets. A new question this time, and quite important, is the impact on innovation. And again, it became clear that standards are seen as making, as having really quite an important impact, positive impact on innovation. We threw a sort of googly in one of the points here, which is the fourth one from the left, which asked if they thought standards stifled innovation due to misuse of standards. And on the whole, the firms did not think that that was the case. So it's quite interesting that the standards are seen as positive for innovation, and that is actually quite encouraging. Supplier relations are considered to be improved very considerably by standards, and this is so particularly at a global level. So that's what's come out of the survey. It's quite a complex survey. I've just skimmed the surface of it. There's a lot more than I've revealed, and very happy to talk more about it if you're interested. Let me come down to the economic modeling. And this is actually quite fun. It's, we've tried to move the thing on from what we did last time, where we basically only looked at productivity. This time we've looked at productivity. We've also looked at trade, and then we've combined the effects in a macroeconomic model. We fed the results of the macroeconomic model into an input-output model. And what that's given us is the sectoral implications and the environmental implications, while the macro model has given us the impact on GDP, on the labor market, and on SMEs. We calibrated the trade model that we'd developed for an earlier study to take account of the impact on exports. And what we calculated is that exports are boosted by about 2/3% for an annual increase in standards. I should say the annual increase in standards is about 4.3% each year. But there is not only just a boost to exports, but there's a boost to the terms of trade. It means that you buy more for your buck effectively. And that's a boost of 0.76%. You should really add the two together to get you some sense of the boost to your trading effectiveness as a result of the use of standards. The estimated boost to productivity from an average year's increase in standards is a boost of 0.3%. So we've put both these things, we've shot the simulation model by adjusting them to take account of a boost to exports, an improvement to the terms of trade, and an improvement to productivity. And this is what emerges. First of all, exports are boosted by an amount that builds up to 0.8% after 5 years. Productivity, which is initially shocked by 0.3, is boosted further by an amount that builds up to 0.5% after 3 years. Business investment, and this is one of the most important things, is boosted by an amount that keeps on increasing through, we ran the modeling for 15 years, and it builds up to 3.5% after 15 years. The cost of living is reduced, and with today's inflation figures, that's an important factor at the front of anyone's mind. The cost of living is reduced by 0.3%. And if you take it together, each year's accretion of standards gives a 0.4% per annum boost to growth on average over the 10-year period, which is worth 8.8 billion a year annually. And of course, it's still rising towards the end of the period because of the build-up in the investment impact. When we did the sectoral analysis, it's very interesting. The IT sector came across as by far the sector that's most impacted by standards. And construction came out second in this. Now, I think both benefit, both from the direct impact of standards, but also from the fact that standards tend to boost investment, and they fit together. Now, the final thing from these macro results is that because you've got extra growth, and to some extent the cost of public spending is reduced a little bit in certain areas of public procurement, public finances are actually 14 billion per annum better after 15 years. That's really quite useful, because at the moment, with a big budget deficit, being able to reduce it as a result of something like standards is important. Of the other macro results, initially, productivity means that employment is slightly lower, but it all gets reversed because the stronger growth and the stronger economy means that the growth outweighs the productivity impact. And after 15 years, employment is up by just over 100,000. Now, although the survey shows that SMEs don't, in theory, benefit as much as larger firms, because of their prevalence in the most affected sectors like IT, the actual impact on SMEs turns out, after all the modeling, to be remarkably similar to that of the whole economy, which is slightly counterintuitive, but it's because of the impact on areas like IT, which traditionally have got lots of relatively small firms. The final thing that's emerged from the macro modeling is the impact on environmental emissions. Now, remember, you've got two different influences happening here. First of all, you've got more growth. And secondly, standards tend to mean that firms are more efficient. And so for each unit of growth, they have lower emissions. Taking the two together, the benefits of more efficiency outweigh the benefits of the greater growth. And environmental emissions per annum are reduced by 0.26%. And remember, this compounds up, so you get a bigger impact eventually. The pictures give you some idea of how the impacts build up. You get an initial serious gain over about 3 years. And then as the effects feed through to the economy, you get a gradual increase after that. Finally, after roughly 10 years, you get quite an impact on investment. And so the GDP impact builds up again. This shows the investment. And so, and shows how much the investment builds up as it goes on. So just to summarize, standards are increasingly playing a role which goes way beyond the simple economic. There are clear impacts on productivity, innovation, supply chain, market access, export access, and competitiveness, and we can see that from the survey. The direct impact on productivity that we estimated is much the same as the last time round when we did the study, but we get a bigger impact on GDP in this analysis than we got before because of the estimated impact on trade and the estimated impact on innovation. I've given you the numbers on the GDP. I've given you the numbers on investment. GDP is worth 8.8 billion a year, and it's building up, and investment is 1.7 billion a year and building up. So the net of it is it's saying that standards are pretty important in terms of the overall economy. And just one statistic I might give you just to finish off: about a quarter of the growth in the whole UK economy that we see comes from standards. That's quite an important impact. Thank you very much for being so patient. And I will stop sharing.
Right. Thank you, Doug, for that. We'll let that sink in with you while and we are here for any questions. Just worth me saying, while people think about what questions they might like to put up, like Andrea, you're right, there is the report available. It will be. So as Doug says, there's just some final edits that are happening now, and then as soon as they are done, we will make that available. You know, this is very much CBR's work, and so we will just we will be the vehicle for making it available. We will also, over the next few weeks, be producing some supporting materials, summary, nice brochures and things like that, which will all go onto the economic benefits page on the BSI website, which is bsigroup.com/economic benefits. That will continue as the page that it was from last time. And so the report itself, but also support materials, will be added over time. As we say, as Doug said, he's just doing the final bits now, so I think we should have it available looking like the end of the month, very early December.
Right. Shall I take the next question?
Or,
it's from Daniel Vandenberg. I'll read out the question for those who haven't seen it. Thanks, Doug. Very interesting results at the micro and macro level of analysis. Can you say something on your error bars, sizes, margins, and confidence limits? It's a very good question. And I mean, my answer will sound almost like the Prime Minister at question time. Except I won't turn the question back on you and say, have you got any error figures or anything like that? I'll try and avoid that fairly standard Boris technique. The way you do these things, there isn't a very simple way of being certain what your errors are. What you normally do when you look at the results of macro models, and most of the numbers come from macro models, is you measure the error by looking at past errors, which is okay if you've done this lots of times and have got a sort of prediction and a result to compare with. But of course, we don't actually have the counterfactual alternative existing. So we can't tell how right or wrong we are. The normal errors in models when they're giving predictions are about plus or minus between 3/4 and 1%. But I don't want to suggest that when you're doing a what if simulation, the errors are on that scale. There is no very easy way of working this out. So my guess is that we're probably somewhere a third. I think if we did it a different way, we could get the impact down by a third. If we did it another way, we could get it up by a third. But that's a very subjective measure. And I don't promise, I mean, the technology doesn't at the moment exist to do this scientifically. If you tried to do it, what you'd end up by doing is multiplying everything up and getting a silly number. And what we don't know is enough about the covariances to be able to find out what the offsetting errors are.
I think it also has to be said, Doug, though, that this research follows on from your own research previously, which itself followed on from some research that government had commissioned 10 years prior. There have been other studies done in other countries as well, some of which I think, or if not all of which, are covered in the literature review that will be part of this report. And you can also have a look online at the ISO research library, which collects together many studies about standards. So, I think BSI is not alone, and the UK is not alone in grappling with these issues and sort of the lack of a possibility of counterfactual. So other studies have done it. So I think we're in line broadly, I think, with some of the assumptions with what other studies have done. And you do see consistency around the world, certainly for sort of similarly developed economies.
I'm sorry, can I just, the bit where we did do an error calculation is we looked at the range for the productivity impacts, and they were between 0.5 and 1.1 for the labor productivity. So that, I mean, that's in line with my estimate of saying that if you take the center of that and go to the bottom or go to the top, it's about a third.
Yeah. There is a question in the Q&A box, another one from Andrea. Very interested in the 0.26% reduction of emissions. Is this in a specific sector?
It's not really. The distribution of the emissions benefits are fairly evenly distributed in line with the productivity benefits. That's more by assumption than because we actually had detailed information about emissions, because we did the calculation based I mean, it's actually one of these interesting things. The first calculation is we did the impact on emissions directly, and then we realized, well, that's producing higher emissions because you've got higher GDP. And if you use fixed coefficients, then GDP goes up, emissions go up. And that was clearly the wrong answer. So we had another look. And what we eventually did, and we decided it was the right way to do it, is we worked out what the improvements in efficiency were for each sector and then totaled them up. And that's what came up with that was what came up with the negative bit that gave a net effect of 0.26%. And the net effect comes from that improvement in efficiency, that improvement in productivity throughout the area. So they're scaled in line with the productivity benefits, which are fairly evenly spread across. I think there's, the strongest ones have an impact which is about 1.5 times bigger than the average, and the lowest are about half less. So that gives you some idea of the scale. The actual details for all 104 sectors are in the report.
Okay, thank you. Right. Anyone else out there with burning questions or observations even? Do people feel that this is a report that you could share with your stakeholders? Is this something that when you, I know some of you who are involved in standards committees sometimes feel a little bit alone. Not everyone in your organizations always understands the benefits. So does this help? Will this be useful collateral for you when the report and other materials are available?
Well, can I turn that question round very slightly? What could we do to make it useful for you?
Yeah, we're always on the search for other ideas, what else we need to, how we need to present things, and maybe other research we need to do. It has to be said that, maybe I can just mention that this is something that that Doug hasn't been involved with, but we have, we've been involved in a project where it's gamification, using gamification, where we've taken 3 standards, energy management, occupational health and safety, and information security. We will be putting these online soon for people to sort of play through them and almost simulate what the use of standards in a company could achieve. So that's another way of thinking about what standards can do for you. And for all of them, of course, you'll notice they're the big management system standards, and there are some quite big meaty questions there that people need to answer. And that aims to answer some of the questions around what sort of the initial investment to implement a standard versus the eventual return in an individual company. Right, Andrea, useful to get the findings in graphic form, share the findings with colleagues in BSS. Absolutely, I'm commissioning some graphics right now that really try to bring this to life, because not everybody can read a 100-page economic report. We know that.
Unless they've got insomnia.
Right, and Sahar, well, yes, thank you. Presenting the work to policymakers. I think, well, as you know, Sahar, we've done quite well with over the last 6 years talking about the results of the previous study with policymakers. It's always interesting, and Daniel, with his challenge right at the beginning there on sort of confidence and tolerances and things like that, these are some of the comments that we get, and we need to anticipate them. So I think really we can say that this is what this study has shown. We can talk about how it's in line with other studies around the world. We can also acknowledge that there are perhaps some assumptions there, but this is the best indication that we have, and there isn't anything else available. Mike, and so looking at sustainable finance, what can we use from this information to persuade financial institutions of the benefits of standards to them in their financing activities? Well, perhaps that's a conversation we need to have, Mike, about how we can tell the story, I think, from this. This is what I'm interested in. So Mike, a fellow colleague at BSI, but to, you know, colleagues at BSI and to people who participate in standards making or standards users, how we can make this relatable, how we can tell that story. I think this is something that I'm here for very much. If you've got things that you need to use to present out to your networks, then let's talk about how to make that story relatable.
Can I just add in two little bits? First, we've seen the impact on the environment, which is positive, despite the fact you've got extra growth. And as you know, normally extra growth goes the wrong way in terms of the environment. But what this is saying is the boost to efficiency offsets the extra growth. And so you get quite a considerable benefit. The second thing is that actually, if you look at the finance sector comes out very strongly as one of the sectors that benefits from standards. And having worked in the finance sector myself, I can see exactly why there are these potential gains in productivity and hence in output. So I think it's important that both aspects of this are communicated to the sustainable finance sector, the benefits to the sector itself and the benefits to sustainability.
Right, we've got a few more things that have come in. So Douglas in the Q&A box is encouraged by the view that large corporations are not using standards as barriers to trade and innovation. I'm encouraged too, because this is part of the, actually going back to Sahar's question, this is one of the things we say to policymakers, that standards are a way of avoiding barriers to trade and barriers to innovation. It is so, but where there are anomalies in standards or where there are things that are out of date, yes, they do need to be revised, and we absolutely rely on our community of experts and users to bring these things to our attention. If you're on a committee, to seek to resolve them on the standards that you're responsible for. The standards are only, they retain their power, if you like, because we try to maintain them, we try to update them as much as possible. So that's a constant issue, and that's why we are constantly looking at reviewing the portfolio, and why. So the renewal rate, that when Doug talks about the growth in the rate of standards, of course, many of them are replacements of existing standards.
To the others, the Q&A, I think some of them are more for you than for me.
So, well, Daniel, following up from his own work on horizon scanning for OPSS, trends of areas of standards or types of standards that are growing over time are expected to grow, and what is driving that growth would be useful output. Okay, I think some of that maybe builds on this CEBR work, Daniel, and also some of the horizon scanning work that we're doing internally in BSI, some of the discussions we're having with Innovate UK, and others. This absolutely does chime with a lot of conversations that are going on, with the work that we've got going on with the standards for the Fourth Industrial Revolution project as well, and bringing in the wider quality infrastructure, of course, with our friends in NPL and UCAS, and beyond. So I think that's a conversation we need to continue to have.
And to go back to the survey, health and safety, environment were the two things that came out most from both the literature review and the survey as increasing over time. And in terms of sectors, definitely it's the service sector and particularly IT. These are the ones that came out from our own work. But I think that fits very well with exactly what Daniel is saying there.
Andrew would like to include a news item to share with IFAN colleagues in the next newsletter. Of course, let's talk about that. Yeah, we can sort that out very easily for you. Thomas, to what extent the work of conformity assessment bodies in certifying standards contributes to the overall effect? I'm not sure that we've broken that out specifically in this report, Doug.
No, unless there are bits of the survey that haven't been shared with me. But
no.
I mean, it's obvious they must be important.
Yeah.
If you don't have them, then you don't have the standards, as far as I can see. So they must be important, but it doesn't emerge directly from this analysis.
But this does link to, I think UCAS a few years ago tried to do an economic benefits of accreditation study, and I think there may be some more there that we could think about picking up with regard to how the quality infrastructure more broadly works, particularly conformity assessment. And we know that conformity assessment relies heavily on standards, and in these post-Brexit times, there's a particular, there are some really topical issues there. So that might be worthy of a further deep dive.
you want to pick up Dave Matthews' question?
Dave point, well, yes. The people I know in government are, so some of the policy people I'm dealing with are enormously grateful to the standards community, because they know that when they're making policy decisions that use standards, they couldn't have those standards without the people and the time and the resources that standardizers put in. So certainly we in BSI are also very grateful to this community of more than 12,000 people that put that work in just in the UK, let alone around the world. Maybe there is more that we could do to tell that story and surface that message. And just before I go back to the other Q&A box, my former colleague Richard, who's now at UCAS, looking at more research into the value of accreditation to the economy, so we need to pick that up. Yeah.
I'll go back to Dave's question just very quickly.
Yeah.
There is a question about why people indulge in standard making in the survey. And what emerges is quite a lot of it is pro bono. And people do it not because they think that they're going to get a specific advantage for themselves or their firms, but they're doing it because they actually think it's the right thing to do. And I mean, one forgets, I mean, the sort of simple economic model that people only do things for their own advantage. I think it always breaks down. I think we're a much more complicated beast than simply one that follows simple economics and so on. And it's actually quite encouraging to hear how many people think that they're doing it because it is the right thing to do.
Yeah, yeah. Abdul makes the point in the Q&A box, standards committees are essentially run by volunteers since there's a clear economic benefit. Does it make sense to fund this activity to increase engagement? Well, of course, you may or may not know that, Abdul, that in other countries, people pay to sit around the standards table. So it's the other way around, and we don't have that model in the UK, but equally we don't have a funded model either. There is there has historically been, although COVID has disrupted it, there's been a part of the base funding to BSI which has contributed some, sometimes a very small, but at least a contribution to the travel costs of eligible UK delegates and experts and chairs to committees. It is always a fraught question. You know, someone somewhere has to pay, someone somewhere has to give up their time, and I think that's why the part of the survey that Doug's just highlighted in terms of why do people participate in standardization, and I think in terms of the survey, that's both directly in committees but also through providing comments during online consultation periods, is because of the ultimate benefit they see for the creation of standards in the sectors and the subjects that they care about. But always happy to continue to have this kind of policy level conversation about what is the best way to support standardization and how can we ensure that we maximize the benefit for the UK. So I'll mark that one as answered in that box. We've got just sort of 5 or 6 minutes left of this time. So lovely to have such engagement with all of you, but I don't know, nothing else popping up in the chat. Perhaps we could just sort of round off at this point and give everybody a little comfort break before they jump on their next session.
Thank you so much for paying so much attention. I don't know if any of you have fallen asleep because I can't see you, but judging by the quality of the Q&A, there's been a lot of engagement. So thank you so much for your attention.
Oh, and there we are, still awake in Wokingham. There we are. Thanks, Richard. A little nod there to my hometown. And well, I'm glad that we have kept you all awake, and that the post-lunch slump, maybe we've stimulated you and you've not fallen asleep after your sandwich. So that's always encouraging.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for the engagement.
Cheers.
All right then. Bye-bye.